Episode 1. The scientists have arrived at the observatory. They are discussing yesterday's launch. Banani, I still don't understand how the launch team got locked out. Papaya, it's because the entrance keys were in the shuttle. Ravioli, which shuttle? The one they launched yesterday? Papaya, yes, one of the astronauts found them during the mission. Ravioli, and how did they end up there? Papaya, I had put them in my raincoat. Banani, and? Papaya, the problem is, it wasn't exactly my raincoat. Ravioli, oh, no. Papaya, it was one of the space suits. Banani, so what did you take home? Papaya, the space suit. Igor, goodbye, spacewalk. Banani, yeah, but how did they launch the shuttle without entering the control room? Papaya, it seems the shuttle took off on its own. Ravioli, on its own? But shuttles don't just launch by themselves. You have to press the launch button. Igor, yeah, the big red one that says launch. Banani, wait. Now that I think about it, that button was faulty. Ravioli, oh, right. That could explain everything. Papaya, yeah, but why didn't you stop them, then? Banani, well, actually, I thought I had fixed the problem. Papaya, how? The replacement parts haven't even arrived yet. Banani, well, Papaya, you know that the great Banani doesn't need replacement parts. Just a bit of duct tape. Igor, and a good dose of recklessness. Ravioli, actually, the keys aren't the only thing that got lost. Banani, no. What else went missing? Ravioli, well, I thought the launch was tomorrow, so I borrowed the astronauts' lasagna rations. Papaya, why did you do that, Ravioli? What are they going to eat for the next 6 months? Ravioli, let's just say I wanted to experiment a little. Banani, yeah, and you ended up eating all of them. Ravioli, yes, but look here. I bought some replacements. Ravioli holds up a bag containing food trays. Banani, looking inside the bag, but there's nothing but wrappers in here. Ravioli, well, when I found out the shuttle had already taken off, I couldn't just let all that delicious food go to waste. Igor, oh, of course, Ravioli. A true act of generosity, towards your stomach. Papaya, Igor. Why didn't you remind me to check the keys last night? This is your fault again. Igor, Professor, I told you at least 5 times. But you were too busy on the phone with your family group chat. Papaya, oh, right, my siblings were stuck at the supermarket checkout. Igor, of course, a nasal level emergency. Papaya, yeah, but their card wasn't going through. Igor, not to meddle in your personal business, Professor, but maybe you could have solved your siblings' grocery issue after dealing with the astronauts, and their oxygen system. Banani, so, in the end, did they make it? Papaya, oh, yeah, it was just a connection problem. Banani, so everyone's okay? Papaya, my sister, the one studying shopping techniques, still has a bit of a cold, but other than that. Banani, no. What are you talking about? Not your siblings. The astronauts? Papaya, the astronauts? Oops. I completely forgot about them. Ravioli, don't worry, they just made an emergency landing, in the mall parking lot. Papaya, oh, yeah, look. My sister just sent me the video on my phone. Igor, dear Papaya, if the astronauts had relied on you, by now they'd be paying for their oxygen tanks in 3 easy installments. The workday is going smoothly, and the 4 are working as usual. Between one measurement and another, Ravioli shares a story. Ravioli, guys, something curious happened to me. I was at a used book stall and saw a book on sale. Banani, The book was used and also on sale? Ravioli, let's just say the previous owner had an excessive love for coffee. Banani, what do you mean? Igor, he means full of mold. Banani, ah, I see. And what's the title? Igor, why do you want to know, Banani? Are you planning to borrow it? Or maybe, like the previous owner, you're also a fan of coffee stains. Ravioli, it's called 5 Minimal Facts on the Resurrection of Christ. Papaya, oh, Ravioli. I didn't think you were interested in this kind of topic. Ravioli, actually, I bought it by mistake. Banani, by mistake? What do you mean, by mistake? Ravioli, well, I misread the title. I thought it was a cookbook. Banani, what did you read? Ravioli, I read 5 minty tarts from the restaurants of Cyprus. Banani, but that's completely different. How did you mess that up? Ravioli, well, it was lunchtime. As they say, I was so hungry I couldn't see straight. Igor, well, now we can literally say that nothing stops Ravioli's appetite. Not even coffee stains or mold. Banani, so, what does this book say in the end? Ravioli, the author claims that there is historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Banani, and what is this evidence? Ravioli, the book is quite long, but the author summarizes it into 5 key points, which he calls minimal facts. Banani, why does he call them that? Ravioli, he calls them minimal because they are historical facts that the majority of scholars consider true. Banani, wait a second, I thought all historians agreed on how history played out. Ravioli, if only it were that simple. In reality, historians often have different opinions about past events, especially when dealing with events that are both ancient and significant. However, the minimal facts are those points on which most scholars, regardless of their personal beliefs, agree. Banani, so in the end, how do we actually know what really happened? Ravioli, we can never know with absolute certainty what happened in the past, but we can reconstruct it as reliably as possible based on the available evidence. Historians use specific criteria to determine which events are most likely. Banani, but don't they all look at the same evidence? Why don't they agree? Ravioli, yes, they all have access to the same evidence, but the problem lies in how they interpret it. Historians start from different assumptions, such as whether supernatural events are possible. This affects their conclusions, even if the evidence is the same. Banani, but if we exclude supernatural events, do historians always agree? Ravioli, not always. Even on natural events, there can be disagreements. Historians interpret facts based on different sources, analytical methods, and even personal beliefs. That's why debates exist even about historical events that have nothing supernatural about them. Igor, there's one thing all scholars do agree on, that the real mystery isn't dark matter, but how you guys manage to survive every day. Banani, I didn't think studying history was so complex. But in the end, how do they all agree on whether an event actually happened or not? I think I heard you mention probability. Ravioli, exactly. Historians can't go back in time to verify events firsthand, so they work with probabilities. They analyze available sources, compare testimonies, and assess how plausible an event is based on the evidence. If a fact is confirmed by multiple independent and consistent sources, it is considered highly probable. Banani, and how do they determine whether an event is true or not? Do they use numbers, like 50%, or do they have some kind of map? Ravioli, ah, I see. Historians use a probability scale to classify events. Generally, they categorize events as follows. Certain, when there is overwhelming evidence, and no one doubts it. Almost certain, when the evidence is very strong, but there's still a small margin of uncertainty. Highly probable, when most of the evidence points in one direction, but alternative explanations exist. Possible, when some evidence exists, but there are also many uncertainties. Unlikely, when the evidence is scarce or contradictory. Highly unlikely, when the evidence is weak or almost non-existent. Impossible, when something contradicts established historical facts or is blatantly false. The more an event meets the criteria we discussed earlier, the higher it ranks on this scale. Banani, so, studying history is different from math, it's more like a trial, where the historians are the jurors. Ravioli, exactly. In math, you can prove something with absolute certainty, while in history, you have to rely on evidence and interpretation. Historians, just like jurors in a courtroom, analyze testimonies, check the consistency of sources, and assess which explanation is the most probable. They can't go back in time to see what happened, so they have to reconstruct events as rigorously as possible using the historical method. Igor, so, Papaya, thanks to the historical method, you might finally solve the mystery of where you put your glasses while you were looking for them. Banani, so, the author of the book claims that there are 5 historical facts that almost all scholars consider certain. And these facts also serve as historical evidence for the resurrection. Ravioli, almost all, you said it right. There will always be some scholar who might disagree with one of the 5 facts. But, on the other hand, the majority agrees. Banani, this book sounds really interesting. As soon as you read more, let me know what it says. Now I'm curious to know what these pieces of evidence for Jesus' resurrection are. Ravioli, and to think, I always believed the resurrection was just a silly superstition. But it seems there is actual evidence. Papaya, if there is evidence, we must evaluate it carefully. And we can't underestimate Jesus' impact on history. Igor, I agree with that conclusion, and I've also come to another one. Here it is, when Ravioli is hungry, it's best to keep him away from the chemistry lab. Banani, and why is that? Igor, because otherwise, thinking he's in the kitchen, he might create an explosive recipe. Episode 2. 3 renowned scientists Papaya, Banani, and Ravioli along with their assistant Igor, work at the Nasal Observatory. We are at the observatory. The scientists are working with full concentration. Suddenly, Papaya smacks his forehead loudly. The others jump up, startled, their eyes wide open. Banani, what happened, Papaya? Papaya, oh no. How could I forget the conference on dark matter? It's happening tomorrow. Banani, Papaya. How could you forget? That conference is crucial, we can't miss it. Ravioli, if we don't go, we'll fall behind the others. Papaya, wait. Let me check my agenda. Yes, just as I thought. Do you want the good news or the bad news first? Igor, oh great, here we go again. Ravioli, what's the good news? Papaya, we have the tickets. Banani sighs in relief. And the bad news? Igor, that we have to travel with Papaya. Papaya, the flight is in 2 hours. Igor, 2 hours? Oh no. We'll make it just in time to watch the plane take off without us. Banani, so, in this book you're reading, the author claims that there's actual evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. Ravioli, yes, remember. We called them the 5 minimal facts. Banani, yes, I remember. They're 5 historical facts that most scholars agree on. Ravioli, exactly, but we need to specify one detail. Banani, what? Ravioli, most of the information comes from the New Testament and other ancient Christian texts. Banani, yes, but that doesn't count. Whoever wrote those texts is clearly biased. Ravioli, in any case, they're ancient historical texts. They're testimonies from that time. We can't dismiss them completely just because they're biased. No historian would do that. Banani, you mean historians even use the New Testament as a source? I've always thought the Bible was just a collection of legends. Ravioli, actually, historians treat the New Testament like any other ancient document. They don't start by assuming it's true or false, they critically analyze it, just like all historical sources. Sure, the people who wrote those texts were believers, but that's true for many other historical documents. If we were to discard all sources written by people with a point of view, there'd be nothing left of ancient history. Igor, if we applied this criterion to Popea's ideas and critically analyze them, we'd have to ignore all his plans, which, in fact, wouldn't be such a bad idea. Banani, I thought the Bible was only studied by theologians. Ravioli, actually, the problem pointed out by the author is that there are two categories of New Testament scholars. The first is the conservatives, who study the New Testament and are believers. That's why they consider the Bible to be the Word of God and take it as true from the outset. The second group is the liberal or critical scholars, who are ready to question every piece of content. Banani, I bet most scholars are conservatives. Ravioli, exactly. This group represents the overwhelming majority of New Testament scholars, about 90%. Banani, see. Then these proofs are useless. It's obvious that most scholars will always agree that the Bible tells the truth. That's because they base it on their faith. Ravioli, of course, the author wouldn't have even written this book if he hadn't taken that point into account. In reality, these 5 facts are accepted and considered true by most critics. Igor, Nasal, on the other hand, skipped all of that and hired you on trust, the greatest scientific mistake in history. Banani, I get it. So the author only relies on material from liberal scholars and not from conservatives. Ravioli, exactly. And that's the strength of the argument. We don't rely on the assumption of faith, but only on objective evidence, which even the critics themselves, or at least the majority of them, can't deny. Banani, now that I think about it, I've heard one of these critics talk about the New Testament, saying it's full of mistakes and contradictions. Ravioli, the author also addresses this point, emphasizing that the media gives much more weight to the critics than to others, even though they are in the minority. In his book, the author doesn't hide his conservative stance and explains that there are ways to show that these supposed contradictions are only apparent and can be explained. However, he warns us that this is not the topic covered in the book. In reality, the presence of errors and contradictions does not affect the historical certainty of the 5 facts. Banani, I understand. So, the discussion is about the historical certainty of the 5 points, not whether the Bible has errors or not. Ravioli, exactly. Anyone who wants to delve into the historical reliability of the Bible has books and books to explore, but in the case of the minimal facts, we don't care about that at all. Popea, from what I know, everyone says the Bible is full of contradictions, but personally, I've never read it. Igor, certainly, no one expected anything different from you, Popea. Igor notices something unusual. Igor, wait a minute. What are your clothes doing here at the observatory? Don't you have a home? Ravioli, actually, the guy from the shop across the street asked us to hold onto them for a while. You know, his new summer collection arrived, and he didn't have any more space in the store. Igor, yes. Ravioli is someone who takes everything literally. I wonder if, when the shop guy handed him the boxes of clothes to keep them, he expected Ravioli to literally keep the clothes on himself. I also wonder if he imagined that Ravioli would guard the box so carefully that he'd take them on his trip. Banani, hey, Ravioli. Watch out with that coffee. Igor, one thing's for sure, if that guy ever gets his merchandise back, those clothes will end up like Ravioli's book, used, and also on sale. The 3 continue to fill their bags with superfluous and unnecessary items. Banani, hey, Ravioli, I can't find the oscilloscope. Have you seen it by any chance? Ravioli, don't worry, I've already packed it. Papaya, hey, guys, don't forget the transformers for the terminals. Otherwise, we won't be able to do those measurements from the hotel window. Banani, don't worry, Papaya. I've got it covered, they're in the bags with the spectroscope. Igor, gentlemen, don't you think it's a bit excessive to bring all this stuff? Isn't a notepad enough to take notes? But, focused on their task, none of them respond. Igor, maybe the conference will help clear up the confusion in their minds. In fact, more than brilliant, theirs seem to contain dark matter. Episode 3. Three renowned scientists Papaya, Banani, Ravioli, and their assistant Igor work at the Nasal Observatory. Papaya remembers that the flight for the conference is in 2 hours. We are at the observatory. Banani and Ravioli are packing. Papaya is on the phone with the taxi dispatcher. The others, having finished putting together their equipment, are trying to close their overstuffed suitcases as quickly as possible. But the rush doesn't stop our heroes from continuing the discussion about Ravioli's book. Banani, all right, so we can use the New Testament and other ancient works by Christian authors as historical sources, as long as we filter the information through certain criteria that historians know how to apply to determine how credible something is or not. Ravioli, exactly. Historians apply specific criteria to assess the reliability of a document. They don't accept everything as true uncritically, but examine elements like multiple attestations, embarrassment, historical consistency, and other rules that help establish how likely an event is. Igor, if we applied these methods to Papaya, the result would be clear, highly unreliable source, prone to repeated errors and systematic contradictions. Banani, all right, so I think we're ready to see these 5 facts. What's the first one? Ravioli, the first of the 5 minimal facts is that Jesus died on the cross. Banani, oh, yes. Are there any proofs? I thought Jesus never even existed. Ravioli, not only did he exist, but we have at least 15 ancient authors who write about him and his death on the cross. Banani, well, somewhere the legend must have started. How do we know it wasn't just that? Ravioli, we know because these 15 authors wrote within less than 100 years of his crucifixion. Can you tell me how they would have written about Jesus if he didn't actually exist? Banani, I don't know, maybe it was just rumors. After all, weren't they all Christians? Ravioli, not all of them. In fact, we also have non-Christian sources confirming that Jesus died by crucifixion. Banani, oh, really? Give me an example. Ravioli, the most famous example is that of Josephus Flavius, a Jewish historian, who wrote in the 1st century. Banani, in the 1st century? You mean he was a contemporary of Jesus? Ravioli, not only a contemporary, but also an opponent of the Christian movement. For the Orthodox Jews of that time, Christians were a heretical sect. That's why they were the first to persecute them. Banani, so Josephus Flavius couldn't have just been giving credit to a rumor. He was certain that Jesus really existed and had died on the cross. Ravioli, exactly. Josephus Flavius not only confirms that Jesus existed, but also attests to his death by crucifixion. And this is significant because he had no interest in supporting the Christian cause, in fact, he criticized it. If even an opponent of Jesus like him confirms it, that's another indication that the story is historically solid. Igor, it's like Ravioli writing that fasting is good, at that point, it would be an undeniable historical fact. Banani, you said 15 sources from less than a century after, and among them, even hostile sources? With this kind of evidence, I don't think any historian in the world would deny that Jesus ever existed. Ravioli, exactly. In addition to the 4 Gospels, we have the following non-Christian sources. In 73, Mara bar Serapion, a Syrian philosopher, mentions him in a letter to his son. Around 93, Josephus Flavius, a Jewish historian, mentions him in his book Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 3, verse 3. In 116, Tacitus, a Roman historian, mentions him in the Annals, passage 15.44. Around 150, the Talmud, a collection of Jewish books, mentions him in Sanhedrin, 43a. Around 250, Lucian of Samosata, a Greek satirical writer, mentions him in his story The Death of the Pilgrim. Today, the death of Jesus on the cross is a historical certainty. Benani has forced the suitcase zippers too much. Benani, damn. All the zippers broke. Papaya, quick. Let's go, the taxi is already coming. They run outside. Igor, at least now customs won't even need to ask us to open the suitcases. We are on the stairs of the observatory. The four are rushing out onto the landing. Ravioli, what happened? They put up a sign on the elevator. Benani, out of service. The elevator's broken. Papaya, quick. No time to waste. Let's take the stairs. Igor, after you, Papaya, the honor is yours. Igor stays on the landing while the three rush down the stairs, tripping over the suitcases, which open up and spill all their contents onto the staircase. The scientists tumble down the stairs, overwhelmed by the avalanche of clothes mixed with their tools. Igor watches them, as they wriggle through their things to get back on their feet. Igor, it looks like today science took quite a tumble. Episode 4. Where's the taxi? Three renowned scientists Papaya, Benani, Ravioli, and their assistant Igor work at the Nasal Observatory. Papaya remembers that the flight for the conference is in 2 hours. With their too many, open, and broken suitcases, they create chaos wherever they go. We are on the sidewalk in front of the observatory. The scientists are waiting for the taxi. Finally, after recovering from the incident on the stairs, the group is ready, with their suitcases, in front of the observatory, to catch the taxi. The wait is taking longer than expected. Benani, but didn't you say the taxi had already arrived? Papaya, that's true. Wait, let me check. Papaya checks the app on his phone. Papaya, no. Actually, the taxi hasn't even left yet. Benani, how did you mess that up? Papaya, actually, I read a message from last week. Ravioli, you mean we rushed down the stairs and even fell for a taxi that hasn't even left yet? Igor, typical. Papaya, don't worry. The taxi will be here in 5 minutes. Igor, the famous 5 minutes of Papaya. Used by the most distinguished scientists to test the theory of relativity. Papaya, it's good to take advantage of this time for a double check. Did you get everything? The other two nod absent-mindedly and continue their conversation about the book. Benani, well, even if Jesus really existed and was crucified, that doesn't prove that he rose from the dead. I don't see how we can consider this fact as evidence of the resurrection. Ravioli, you need to be patient, Benani. The 5 facts, taken individually, certainly don't prove the resurrection. But the magic happens when we put all 5 together. Benani, yeah. And how's that? Ravioli, once we establish that all 5 facts are historically certain, the most plausible explanation is the resurrection. Benani, I get it, so I need to wait to hear all 5. Yeah, but then what do I do with these 5 facts? How do they explain the resurrection? Ravioli, like I said, you have these facts that we are certain about. Now, you need to explain them somehow, right? Benani, yeah, that's obvious, if we have these facts, there must be a reason. Ravioli, and that's the interesting part. In fact, if we exclude the resurrection and try to find a naturalistic explanation, we can't find one. Benani, Really? And how can that be? Ravioli, we could answer in many ways, but the best explanation remains the resurrection. Papaya, irritated. As far as I know, the resurrection is just a legend, invented by the church to take money from the simpletons who believe in it. Igor, speaking of relativity. After all the nonsense I've seen these doctors do, the definition of simpleton becomes a very relative concept. Episode 5. Three renowned scientists Papaya, Banani, Ravioli, and their assistant Igor work at the Nasal Observatory. Papaya remembers that the flight for the conference is in 2 hours. With their too many open and broken suitcases, they create chaos wherever they go. In their rush to run down the stairs to catch the taxi, the three scientists fell. We are in front of the observatory, where the scientists are waiting for the taxi. Ravioli, hey, how long is this taxi taking? Banani, Papaya. We've been here for more than half an hour. Papaya, strange, let me check. Oops. I swapped the departure and arrival locations. The taxi is waiting for us at the airport, to bring us here. Ravioli, but... Papaya. Igor, perfect. Now we just need to take a taxi, to reach the taxi. This time, Papaya makes the correct booking. A few minutes pass, and the taxi is already arriving. Banani, look, the taxi is coming. Papaya, start loading the suitcases, we don't have time to waste. Taxi driver, oh, are you crazy? Where am I supposed to put all these suitcases? Papaya, no, they'll fit. Banani, I told you, Ravioli, not to bring the portable particle accelerator. Ravioli, listen who's talking. The one carrying the radio telescope. Papaya, stop it immediately. Sir, could you look the other way? We can give you a generous tip. Taxi driver, fine. But all payments are in advance. Igor, why not 50/50ths? Banani, what do you mean? Igor, 50% chance you'll get us to our destination, and 50% chance you'll run off with the money. Papaya hands over the card with the fare for the ride in advance, including a considerable tip. Igor, Papaya. With these prices, the value of the ride becomes the tip. You'd have been better off leaving the suitcases at home and buying everything once you get there. Papaya, shut up, Igor. Stop talking nonsense. Taxi driver, hey, look, the card didn't go through. Papaya, oh, no. I entered the wrong PIN. Ravioli, be careful. Don't let the card get locked. Papaya, there. Done. Can I get the receipt? Taxi driver, no. I'm already doing you a favor, and now you want me to charge you the taxes too? Igor, this guy is a real philanthropist. I'd like to do a couple of favors like that for someone, just to boost my retirement fund. They are loading the numerous suitcases into the taxi. Ravioli, can you help us load these, taxi driver? Taxi driver, oh, what do you think I am, a bellboy? You load those rocks yourself. I have back pain. The four of them begin loading. Igor, who did we take him for? The real question is, why did we take this taxi? Taxi driver, hey. Be careful with those suitcases, if you scratch my taxi, I'll make you pay for it. Igor, a couple of rides like this, and you can buy yourself a new taxi. Taxi driver, come on. Move it, I'm in a hurry. Don't you know they're already waiting for me at the airport for another ride? Don't waste my time. Igor, taxi driver, you just realized that time flies with us, unlike our plane, it will fly without us. After filling the trunk, the four of them squeeze into the taxi cabin, completely buried under their suitcases. Taxi driver, so. Can we leave? Ravioli, wait. I forgot my passport in the office. Banani, what? Now we'll have to take everything out again. Taxi driver, I'm already regretting accepting your offer. Papaya, yes. But we paid the tip in advance. Ravioli manages to get out of the taxi, once again spilling the contents of several suitcases onto the sidewalk. Igor, Ravioli looks like a Jenga player, but with suitcases. We're in the taxi in front of the observatory, where the other three are waiting for Ravioli. The wait drags on. Banani, look, Ravioli left his book here. Papaya opens the book. Papaya, ouch. What an awful smell of moldy coffee. Banani, what a stench. Papaya, how does Ravioli stand it? Taxi driver, hey. No stinky food in my taxi, or you'll pay for the cleaning, got it? Igor, sorry for the disturbance, taxi driver. We've made your car stink, and on top of that, tonight you'll have a tough time counting all the money we gave you. Banani, read this chapter talks about the 5 minimal facts. Papaya, minimal facts? Banani, these are facts that most scholars, including skeptics, consider to be true. Papaya, so, these facts are supported by solid evidence. Banani, exactly. Scholars, of course, believe them to be true, not because they like to think so, but because they are confirmed by evidence. Papaya, yes, but what's the point of these facts if none of them prove the resurrection? Banani, on their own, they don't prove it, but together, there's no way to explain them other than through the resurrection. Igor, just like these 3 scientists. Taken individually, they get everything wrong, but when you put them together, they still get everything wrong. Papaya, I get it. The minimal facts must all be true at the same time. Banani, now I'll read them to you. First, Jesus died by crucifixion. Second, his disciples were sincerely convinced they met him after his death, resurrected, perfectly healed, and in the flesh. Third, the disciples and the early church began preaching the divinity, death, and resurrection of Jesus immediately, creating an oral tradition that we can trace back to within 2, at most 5, years after the cross. Fourth, Paul, a fierce persecutor of Christians, converts, claiming to have also met the risen Jesus. Fifth, James, Jesus' brother, initially skeptical, converts after his death and begins preaching alongside the disciples. Papaya, it sounds convincing, but maybe they didn't think through all the possibilities. Banani, if you think about it, it's really a puzzle. Papaya, you know what I think? I doubt it's true. I bet if we think about it for a bit, we'll find an explanation. It must be a clever trick to sell books. Igor, did they have a clever trick? Like those scientists? When they decided to leave with all those useless suitcases. Episode 6. 3 renowned scientists Papaya, Banani, Ravioli, and their assistant Igor work at the Nasal Observatory. Papaya remembers that their flight for the conference is in 2 hours. With their suitcases, too many, open and broken, they create chaos wherever they go. They were about to leave in a taxi, but Ravioli forgot his passport in the office. We're in the taxi, in front of the observatory, where the other 3 are waiting for Ravioli. Finally, Ravioli shows up, sweating and looking worried, in front of the window. Ravioli, I turned the whole observatory upside down. I can't find the passport. Banani, I think you put it inside one of your suitcases. We're on the sidewalk in front of the observatory. Ravioli and Banani, working together perfectly, pull all the suitcases out of the taxi and start searching frantically, spilling the contents all over the sidewalk. The taxi driver takes advantage of the moment of distraction and speeds off. But Banani's suspenders got caught in the trunk door. Banani starts running, dragged by the taxi, screaming for help. Finally, Banani's suspenders break, leaving him on the ground 100 meters away. Igor comments, maybe no one's told Benani yet that suspenders, while an elegant accessory, have been out of fashion for about a century. Anyway, if he survives the session of water skiing without skis and without water, he'll need to explain a couple of things. First, how did he manage to close his suspenders in the trunk? I mean, the exact movement. Second, for some obscure reason, after unloading the luggage, he also did the taxi driver the favor of closing the trunk. Maybe he could have tapped on the glass to let him know he could leave. And last, but not least, what will he use instead of suspenders to keep his pants up? We are in front of the observatory, where the four are pondering what to do next. Exhausted, the distinguished doctors sit on the building's stairs. Papaya checks the phone app. Time passes, and it seems that Papaya can't find anything interesting. While waiting, Benani and Ravioli continue their discussion about the book. Benani, we talked about the first fact. I'm curious to know what the second fact is. Ravioli, the second fact is that the disciples were convinced they had met the resurrected Jesus after his death. Benani, is it possible they were lying? Ravioli, and what would they gain from it? Stones thrown at them. Benani, yes, you said the Orthodox Jews began to persecute them. Ravioli, exactly, back then, saying that Jesus was the Son of God was like asking to be stoned to death. Benani, why? Ravioli, it was part of their law. Benani, a very strict law. Ravioli, yes, and very old, dating back to the time of Moses, in the Old Testament. Benani, but why would saying Jesus was the Son of God have been against their law? Ravioli, because the Jews didn't believe Jesus was the Son of God, let alone the Messiah prophesied in the Old Testament. Therefore, saying that Jesus, who they believed was an ordinary man, was the Son of God especially after he had been crucified as a criminal was blasphemy. Benani, yes, but couldn't they just give a fine to anyone who said that? Ravioli, of course not. The Mosaic law, followed by the Jews of that time, prescribed death for such an offense. Igor, fine. Yes, good idea. They should fine me for agreeing to follow you in this madness. At least I'd have some tangible proof of my mistake. Benani, okay. I think we put a lot of meat on the fire. For example, I've always heard about this Messiah, but I've never really understood who he is. Ravioli, according to the Jews of the 1st century, the Messiah was a special man sent by God, who would free Israel from its enemies. Benani, and why didn't they believe that Jesus could be the Messiah? Ravioli, because Jesus was humble, while the Jews expected the Messiah to be a powerful king who would free them from the domination of the Roman Empire. Benani, I see. So Jesus was a spiritual Messiah, not a military one. Ravioli, exactly, according to Christians, Jesus freed them, but not from a dominating army, rather from the sin that every human being is inevitably enslaved to. Benani, but this didn't sound good to the ears of the Jewish religious leaders, who ended up persecuting Christians. Ravioli, that's why the disciples had nothing to gain from preaching the resurrection of Jesus. First, because they themselves were initially Orthodox Jews, so this went against all their principles. Second, because becoming Christian at that time was very dangerous. Benani, in any case, you said that, like the other four, this second fact is supported by abundant evidence. So, we can say that even most critics are certain that the disciples believed they had encountered Jesus risen from the dead. Ravioli, yes, there's a lot of evidence the author shows us. And most critics think this is true, and that the disciples weren't lying. Igor, Benani was dragged for half the neighborhood by a taxi, caught by his suspenders. But now, as if nothing happened, he's talking with Ravioli about the book. Apparently, for Benani, these are things that happen every day. Like a morning routine. Getting out of bed, brushing your teeth, and being dragged by a taxi along the asphalt. Body surfing style but without the surfboard. In any case, apparently, his brain hit the reset button. We are in front of the observatory, where Ravioli is back searching for his passport in the numerous suitcases. Ravioli, this was the last suitcase, and it's not here either. Banani, now what? How are we going to do this? Igor, shall we call a taxi to leave us here? Ravioli, exulting, hey. I found the passport. Papaya, thank goodness. Where was it? Ravioli, I had it in my pocket. What a fool I am. Banani, you're not a fool, you're a real idiot. You made us miss the taxi. Papaya, calm down. Arguing isn't going to help us. We need to find another solution. Igor, in any case, we can say that sometimes the truth is like Ravioli's passport, we don't see it even when it's right under our nose. Episode 7. Three renowned scientists Papaya, Banani, Ravioli, and their assistant Igor work at the Nasal Observatory. Papaya remembers that their flight to the conference is in 2 hours. With their many, open, and broken suitcases, they cause chaos wherever they go. The scientists miss the taxi. We are on the sidewalk, in front of the observatory, where Papaya is trying to find a way to get to the airport. Papaya seems to have finally found something. Papaya, showing the phone, look. This bus goes straight to the airport. Banani, the stop is nearby, let's run. Papaya, run. The bus is already coming. Ravioli, you go ahead. I can't run. Banani, oh, where are you going? Did you forget the suitcases? After a few more trips, they manage to bring all the suitcases to the stop. The bus has arrived, but Banani is still picking up clothes and tools scattered all over the sidewalk. Igor, Papaya, on the phone, should have looked for a moving company instead. We are on the bus, which has stopped near the observatory. The driver is scolding the scientists, who are trying to board with all their luggage, creating a mess. Driver, hey. Stop making a fuss, the bus needs to leave. Banani, just a moment, we just need to grab those hard drives from the storm drain. Driver, oh, do you think you're at home? Papaya, excuse me, Mr. Driver, please, can you wait just a minute? We need to catch the plane. It's very important. Papaya convinces the driver to wait. Driver, just a minute, huh? These idiots are taking forever. At this rate, I'll miss my break at the bar. Finally, they've loaded everything. But as they're finishing getting settled, the driver, extremely angry, takes off at full speed, causing them to fall along with their luggage. Igor, having predicted the scene, holds onto one of the bars. Igor, more than accidents, these falls are becoming a routine for the three scientists. Good thing I always have my phone on hand. Their meme is becoming more and more famous every day. Anyway, with the few bucks they give me, I have to find a way to make extra money by the end of the month. The title of the new video? How about, Poor Physics, the Collapse of the Brainiacs? Or, Scientists Adrift, an Avalanche on the Speeding Bus? Let me know in the comments. Banani, okay, so we've established that the disciples had nothing to gain by lying about Jesus' resurrection. But how can we be sure of what they actually said? Ravioli, we have Paul's testimony. Paul's letters, including 1 Corinthians and Galatians, are considered unquestionably authentic by most critics. Banani, so we can be sure that Paul wrote this testimony in his letters. Ravioli, exactly. And Paul wrote in the 1st century, just a few decades after the crucifixion. There's historical consensus on that. Igor, as authentic as the embarrassing moments we create every single day. Unfortunately, those don't need any evidence to be believable. While waiting to arrive, they discuss Ravioli's book. Banani, yes, but what does Paul have to do with the disciples? Ravioli, by reading his letters, we discover that Paul personally met Peter and James, Jesus' brother. Banani, wait, so we're not talking about second-hand stories. Paul spoke directly with them. Ravioli, exactly. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul mentions going to Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion to meet Peter, and he spent 15 days with him. If the disciples weren't preaching the resurrection, why would Paul be interested in consulting with them? Banani, and what did they say to each other? Ravioli, Paul doesn't report all the details of the conversation, but he says that he wanted to make sure the gospel he preached was the same one announced by the apostles. Banani, and this means the central message of the gospel was already the same as what Paul preached? Ravioli, exactly. And we know what Paul preached, that Jesus died, was buried, and rose again on the third day. If Peter and James hadn't taught the resurrection, Paul would have realized he was preaching a different message, and he would have made that clear. Banani, but then it's implied that the disciples themselves preached the resurrection. Ravioli, exactly. If they hadn't, this letter wouldn't make any sense. Igor, speaking of saying things that don't make sense. Papaya. Episode 8. 3 renowned scientists Papaya, Banani, Ravioli, and their assistant Igor work at the Nasal Observatory. Papaya remembers that the flight for the conference is in 2 hours. With their suitcases too many, open, and broken, they create chaos wherever they go. They took a bus to the airport. We are in front of the terminal, where the bus is stopping. The bus stops in front of the stop, and the driver bids the scientists farewell with a cheerful greeting. Driver, get off my bus. The scientists hurriedly unload their luggage, which, of course, spills open onto the road. Igor, bravo. The classic grand finale of the broken luggage band, exploded luggage and dignity scattered on the highway. It's always a pleasure to travel with you. After picking up the luggage and piling it onto the wobbly carts, they rush toward the check-in. Papaya, hurry up. We still have time. Banani, here's our line. Ravioli, come on, maybe we'll even have time for a snack at the vending machine. Igor, yeah, sure, Ravioli, and maybe a massage and a sauna too. We are at the airport, where the 4 are getting in line. Finally in line, they breathe a sigh of relief. Banani and Ravioli, taking advantage of the wait, continue their discussion about the book. Banani, so, let's recap. The first fact is the crucifixion of Jesus, and we've seen the sources. While the second is the fact that the disciples were convinced of Jesus' resurrection, so much so that they publicly preached it and faced persecution from Jewish religious leaders. Ravioli, yes, and we've seen that we can prove this through Paul's testimony and his letters, which most critics believe were written by him. Banani, but earlier, you mentioned there are other proofs for this second fact. Ravioli, yes, besides Paul's testimony, we have the oral tradition. Banani, and what is this oral tradition? Ravioli, the oral tradition was the way communities passed on information before it was written down. In the first-century Jewish world, it was common to memorize and faithfully repeat important teachings. Igor, important teachings. Like, don't lose your passport at the last minute. We are at the airport. While waiting in line for check-in, they are talking about Ravioli's book. Banani, so, before the Gospels were written, people were already talking about the resurrection? Ravioli, exactly. Scholars believe that some parts of the New Testament contain even older faith formulas that date back to the very first years after the crucifixion. Banani, like what? Ravioli, a clear example is in 1 Corinthians 15:3-7. There, Paul quotes a formula that he says he received and passed on, that Christ died for our sins, was buried, rose on the third day, and appeared to Peter, the 12, and many others. Banani, so Paul isn't making anything up, he's repeating a faith formula that was already circulating among the early Christians. Ravioli, exactly. And scholars date this formula to just a few years after the crucifixion, too early to be a legend. Benani, so, to summarize, we have both Paul's letters, which tell us that the disciples preached the resurrection, and this oral tradition that confirms it. Ravioli, yes, and this shows us that the resurrection was already at the heart of the Christian message from the very beginning. Igor, oh, yeah, Benani. 2 years is too soon for a legend, but too late. For an experiment that doesn't explode. While waiting in line for check-in, they are talking about Ravioli's book. Benani, well, how do we know that Paul didn't just make up this creed? Ravioli, great question. The point is that Paul explicitly says he received this creed and passed it on. This language is typical of the rabbinic tradition to indicate a teaching received from others and not invented. Benani, yes, but he could have still made it up and then passed it off as an older tradition. Ravioli, that would be difficult because Paul says he personally met Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, just a few years after the crucifixion. If he had invented this creed, they would have immediately denied it. Benani, and instead, they don't deny it? Ravioli, no, in fact. The fact that Paul went to them to confirm the gospel he was preaching means that the disciples already had this same message. Benani, so, if I understand correctly, the creed didn't originate with Paul but already existed among the early Christians, and Paul simply passes it on in his letters. Ravioli, exactly. This proves that the disciples believed and preached that Jesus had risen from the dead. Igor, in 1,000 years, if anyone is still around, some will think that Poppeia's travels are just a legend. Indeed, journeys like these seem too absurd to be true. But, in the end, all this crowd that's watching us right now will prevent future generations from thinking of it as a myth. In fact, I can assure you that this story will be told so much that it will become an oral tradition. And when someone wonders if Poppaea and his colleagues were just fictional characters, some historian will answer them, no. Those fools really existed. Episode 9. 3 renowned scientists Poppaea, Benani, Ravioli, and their assistant Igor work at the Nasal Observatory. Poppaea remembers that their flight for the conference is in 2 hours. With their bags, too many, open and broken, they create chaos wherever they go. The scientists have arrived at the airport. We are at the airport, where the 4 are in line for check-in. Finally, it's Poppaea's turn. Assistant, good morning. Passports and tickets, please. Poppaea hands over the documents to the assistant. Assistant, how many bags do you have? Poppaea, we haven't counted them yet. Poppaea, counting the bags there should be 20. Igor, wait a minute. Poppaea, the illustrious scientist who should be able to calculate the distance between galaxies, is having trouble counting to 20. Imagine what happens when he has to do complicated calculations like those for the shuttle launch. Maybe Nasal should reconsider Poppaea's role and cancel a couple of missions for a checkup. That's why, as a kid, I never saw myself as a future astronaut. Assistant, I'm sorry, but I can't check in 20 bags for 4 people. Poppaea, we can pay for the excess. Assistant, let me see the ticket, let's see what I can do. Poppaea, here you go. Igor, Poppaea, why don't you try putting them one inside the other? Oh, I forgot, the bags don't have an inside because they're open. While waiting to complete check-in, they are talking about Ravioli's book. Benani, do you have any more evidence for the second fact? Ravioli, besides Paul's testimony and the oral tradition, written tradition also confirms the second fact. Benani, what sources are there? Ravioli, first of all, we have the 4 Gospels. Benani, yes, we said those are historical texts too. Ravioli, yes, and as we saw earlier, we can consider them independent sources, written just a few decades after Jesus' death. Igor, and now there's a little game for you. Ravioli and Banani are going to miss their flight. What will they do? A. Look for a solution to the luggage problem. B. Worry that they won't be able to travel, or will have to leave some bags behind. C. Or talk about Ravioli's book. I see you've guessed too. The answer is C. Naturally, as if there's nothing better to talk about.